and it encourages more grappling and wrestling techniques. And I think that is where Lichtenauer's method really flowers. And Dr. Anglo pointed out that Lichtenauer's, his writing style uses, it's still medieval in some elements, but it starts to utilize elements that we see in Renaissance thinking. I mean, Lichtenauer quotes Aristotle, or references Aristotle. So it's a change in thinking. It's a more systematic, scientific approach based upon principles of fighting. And that's what puts it into the Renaissance, because all the other stuff that comes later is following that same approach. And if you look at the writings and teachings of Fiore di Liberi, it's the same way. He's very systematic, and it is not a medieval approach. It's a Renaissance approach. And he's writing in 1409, 1410, but he's saying, hey, I'm 55 years old and I'm writing this. So he had to have learned it decades earlier. And that again puts it in the late 1300s, which a lot of Renaissance scholars, and I avoid the arguments between Renaissance scholars and medievalists, because you can't draw a line and say this side is medieval and this side is Renaissance. It's blurry. It's a gray area. And our material begins in that gray area, but it goes in one direction. So it's Renaissance. And then the question is, when does it end? What happens that it ends? Well, my argument is that if you look at post 1670, 1680, in that period, they're no longer concerned with two weapons. They're no longer concerned with fighting a variety and diversity of weapons. They're no longer concerned with grappling and wrestling as a foundational aspect. They're not concerned with daggers. They're not concerned with armor. They're concerned only with two gentlemen with small swords, or what you can do in light cavalry with a saber. And they drop the two-edged weapons, they drop the counter-striking, the master cuts, the binding and winding, the closing and grappling, the bucklers and the daggers. It all goes away. And they only are concerned with a very narrow approach to self-defense, with very, very few exceptions. So
was it because of firearms? Was it because of fire?
Yes, absolutely. There's a work from, I think, the 1640s, one of the German works, and you're flipping through it, and it's all rapier, and then suddenly he's fighting 5 people, and he turns and runs and pulls his pistol out. And that says it all, right there. I mean, once you are doing this, you're no longer coming to school to learn this. Once you have, the common soldiers that are only being taught muskets and bayonets and pikes and halberds, they're not learning close combat sword play. They don't have a need for it. I would tell you an anecdote that I think really sums this up. In 1599, the English master George Silver says, he says, bring me to an Italianated fencer, someone who's using the rapier. He says, bring me to him and I will take him out of his fencing tricks with good downright blows. And he argues that against the rapier, if you close in and get past that point, it can't hit you because its length is too long and he has to take too many steps and you will be just cleaving him. And he says, with a cutting blade, I can fight in war and I can fight on the street and I can cleave your head and I can cut your body into your body cavity and I can dismember you. And other people have said, yeah, and you can cut the straps on armor and you can do none of that with this. All right. And then he says, and I have seen men stabbed, I think he says 30 and 40, no, I think he says 13 and 14 places about the body. They've been stabbed with a rapier and live. But one downright blow from this and you are slain. Okay, he's right. There's no doubting that he's right. It's just fact, it's truth. Okay, fast forward less than 100 years. And the Scottish fencing master, Sir William Hope, who's not teaching an indigenous Scottish method, he's teaching French small sword and English backsword. And William Hope says, against my rapier, if you think that you're just going to knock it aside or break the point and cut me, no. Because I've seen, he says, men that have been slashed 30 and 40 places about the body and live to tell. But one straight thrust and you're dead. Okay. Now, is he wrong? No, he's not. They're both correct. They're both absolutely right. But what happened in that 90-year period between Silver and William Hope? And what happened was guns, guns, guns. So that you're not learning how to do this method with all of its nuances and all of its techniques and all of its binding and winding and short and long edge. Instead, you just have a saber or a cutlass or a backsword and you're going, ah, ah, ah. And William Hope's going, gotcha. Because if you don't know how to foin, to face a thrusting blade, to foin, if you don't know how to foin, he's going to take you out. And in my career, I've lived both of those experiences where I'm training in a side sword, a cut and thrust sword, George Silver style, Degrassi style, Marozzo style. And I'm able to take on people who are new to the rapier and take them apart. And I'm able to take on people who are good with rapier and take them apart because I know this weapon. And I know this weapon. And I can switch. And I can beat this weapon with this, just as some of the other masters say you can, like Joseph Swetnam in 1617. Okay, so it's not the weapon, it's the man. So I see where William Hope is coming from. I understand where he's coming from because you go up against somebody who doesn't know much how to fight with a saber or a cutlass or a broadsword or a side sword, and they're just going, and here I am, expert in the rapier, and it's no contest. I've even done some amusing things with Kinjitsu practitioners where I'll go, okay, go ahead, hit my rapier. And they'll go, and they're like, what just happened? And they miss the rapier because I do this. And I show them the geometry of how that big arcing cut cannot hit this when I do this. It's a simple little ellipse, whereas they're traveling in a big arc. It's a matter of geometry, not even tempo or space. It's geometry. And it freaks them out. And I'm just holding it, going like this. And then I say, okay, and after I give them 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 tries and they can't hit it, I go, now let's see if you can hit it while I'm moving it. And I'm hitting you. And I'll put a mask on them, and then it's, and they're going, and what's funny is that within the first couple of techniques, they're going like this, which completely plays to the rapier's strength. You know, you can't out thrust a rapier with a katana. So again, it comes back to what we were talking about being situational and contextual and having to do with the man and his prowess rather than the weapon. Yet there's no doubt that different weapons give you different advantages and disadvantages. And you have to, as an individual, decide what fits your build, your temperament, your intentions. One of the complaints about this weapon is that it couldn't fight in war. One of the complaints is that it's a murderous tool, because with this, I could cut you a little bit. I could hit you with the flat. I could stab with just this. I could slash with just this. I could hit with this portion. I could hit with this portion. But when it comes to this, really all I can do is point it at you and stab, and it's going to go right through anything and that's it. You know, you as you know, they didn't have internal surgery. They didn't have sutures. So a hole from one of these is they're going to get sepsis. So they get a small hole in them from this, an effortless small hole. And that's the whole scary thing about the rapier. It's effortless. It's so deceptive and so subtle. And it's like, huh. And it doesn't matter if you're Conan, the guy just put a 6-inch hole in you the size of this finger. Now, that hole is not more lethal than the hole this would make in you. This makes a far worse hole. But if you look at this, you go, well, yeah, duh. If I stab you with that, you're dead. It's going to like rip a big hole in you. I can understand that. And to use this against your armor, I'm going to, ah. But this just goes, huh, and there's a hole that's lethal. And that's what freaks them out, because people are coming out with these things and fighting each other with them and killing each other. And they're getting a tiny little hole, and then they're dead. And they're dead in 2 seconds or 2 minutes or 2 hours or 2 days. Or even 2 weeks they're lying around, but they're dead. So the death toll from these and the personal dueling and street fighting with these is higher than it used to be with these when you're going at it sword and buckler or even sword and dagger. And this is reflected in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, where he has the famous duel between Tybalt and Mercutio, and it's sword and dagger, it's rapier and dagger versus sword and buckler. And this is what George Silver is talking about, and so William Smythe is talking about. And so George Silver criticizes the rapier. And his criticism of the rapier is actually the same criticism that Vincenzio Saviolo, Italian writer, has 4 years earlier or 5 years earlier in 1594. He says almost the exact same thing Silver says about the rapier. But everyone ignores Saviolo's criticism because he's a rapier man, whereas Silver's criticisms, they want to go, oh, he didn't know what he was talking about. Well, he did. So contextual, situational, even social, the rules about how people are going to fight, what conditions they're going to fight, duels or street fights, and what I've heard the rapier called a 38 special. You know what a 38 special is? Okay.
You mean,
so it's like the sword equivalent of the 38 special. You're going around town with it. It has one job, just murder somebody with it. But then gangsters will pull these out and go, yeah, come on, let's go at it. Because, and as Dr. Anglo showed, this weapon comes about among the common people. It's street fighters that are using these, and merchants and shopkeepers and brothel keepers are using these. And only later does it get associated with the upper class and studying geometry. And that's what's hilarious. You think Renaissance, you think rapier, but this was only around for about 120 years. This thing's around for about 200, and this thing's around for about 200, 250. So it's wow, you know.
John, I have another question for you. Could you just tell us about the daggers of the period? What kind of daggers they were using?
Well, I'm not a dagger specialist. I'm not a knife specialist. There's so many different weapons in the pantheon of Renaissance weapons. You have to study the sword. There are masters who say the long sword is the foundational weapon. Then there's others who come along and say the rapier is the foundational weapon. And you have to study the buckler and the sword. You have to study the dagger and the sword. You have to study pole arms, spears, halberds, glaives. You know, you have to study that. I argue that you can't study the Renaissance without the side sword as the second most important weapon. So it should go from war sword to side sword to rapier. And the dagger should be in there, as should be the spear or the staff. Because if you can fight with a staff, you can fight with a spear or a halberd or a glaive or a bill or what have you. So when it comes to daggers, there's really just two types. You have your armor piercing dagger, which is rigid and longer, and then you have your parrying daggers or your poignards. But there's other daggers in between that look like any type of knife. There are some that look like a Bowie knife. There are some that look like, you've got stilettos and you've got cincadas and so many different varieties. You've got your basilards and those kind of weapons, the so-called kidney daggers. So you have ones that have double edges as opposed to ones that are designed to fight against armor. I will say, though, that two of our primary sources warn. They'll say, it's Talhofer and Fiore, both say essentially the same thing. They'll go, now we come to the study of the dagger. May the Lord have mercy on us. Why? Why are they saying that about the dagger? Because, as George Silver says, the dagger is such that you can't win or gain the place of it. Meaning you can't bind on it, you can't countercut it, you can't counter thrust it. It's all about getting in close and wrestling. And against a knight in armor, that's what he's more afraid of, is that dagger than he is that sword or that crossbow or that halberd. It's the dagger that's going to get here and here and here and here and here and here. Whew. And I've done unarmored dagger versus armored dagger, and it's scary. That's really all I can say about the dagger, is that it's important. You got to learn it. It's more relevant for modern self-defense than any of this. So I kind of tend to stress that. And the last couple of years, particularly for my female students, I have been stressing more and more the practical aspects of modern self-defense that this brings. The vicious use of short and long daggers and batons and clubs, because it's just more relevant.
Yes, absolutely. John, do you also teach pole arms? You just mentioned them. Just please, could you expand on them? It's also important, right?
You have to. You have to. And whether it's a short staff or a long staff or a half pike or a halberd or a pole axe, I'm not as big on the pole axe because it's a weapon that's more relevant to armored combat, and very few people have armor. And then when they get armor, they have to fight in a particular way. But pole arms are critical. You have to. George Silver says that the best weapon you can have is this long staff with a 3-inch spike on it. And he says, you give me that, I'll take on anything. Sword and buckler, sword and targa, rapier, dagger. I'll take on a bill, I'll take on a halberd, I'll take on two-handed sword, anything. And I'm thinking, yeah, are you talking about walking around town with it? Because who's walking around town with a spear that long with a spike on it? Are you going into the pub with that? And if you're on the battlefield and you've got that, he's got an actual pipe twice the length of it, or you're fighting a group of halberds, that doesn't really make sense. So I think he's kind of saying one-on-one, I'll kick ass with this. And I see where he's coming from, but he's talking unarmored, all right? Because if you're in armor, or if I have a shield and I'm in armor, that thing's not going to have a chance. I've often said this. I said,